Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Tom Ginsberg. I'm the faculty director of the Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression here at the university, which is located about a half a block up. And this is another in our occasional series of faculty conversations where we invite the faculty to discuss important issues to the university. And today's topic is, should divestment be on the table? This was an issue, of course, in the protests last year. It's something that comes up in discussions here at the university from time to time, and one on which our iconic Kalven report is held to stand for a particular position. The Kalven report is available out in the front if you don't have a copy and you want to refer to it during the discussion. We have a fantastic panel today to lead the discussion. Moderating will be Kimberly K. Huang, a member of our faculty advisory board, a professor of sociology and in the college, and a scholar of capitalism in its current stage. She has a wonderful book called Spiderweb Capitalism that I recommend. And our panelists will be Anton Ford, who's a professor of philosophy and currently deputy dean in the humanities division. Anoop Malani, who is the Lee and Brenna Freeman Professor of Law and a professor at the Pritzker School of Medicine, and Luigi Zingales, who is the McCormick Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the Booth School of Business. And the format will be that each panelist will make an opening statement, and then we'll have some discussion up here, but we'll have plenty of time for questions, so do bring your questions and think about them. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Kimberly. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone.
Great. So we'll just go in order, and we'll start with Anton.
Okay. Well, thanks for this invitation to talk about the Kalven report. I wanted to start by saying something that should go without saying, but I think is worth remembering, namely that just because something's in the Kalven report doesn't make it true. It's not a holy text, and a community of scholars is not a religious order. Nevertheless, I want to talk about what it does say and put it in some historical context, largely with a view to distinguishing what the Kalven report says from the policy of this university for the last couple of decades. For the last 20 years or so, going back to President Zimmer, it's been university policy that, except in that case where the university's own educational mission is at stake, the university should never, under any circumstances, take a political position. And so it should never, under any circumstances, divest or submit its investment decisions to any kind of ethical or political criterion, and it should never dissociate itself from any state, no matter what crimes that state is perpetrating. Now, this policy of the last 20 years is a repudiation of the central finding of the Kalven report. The report's central conclusion is that certain, quote, extraordinary circumstances apart, there emerges a heavy presumption against the universities taking collective action or expressing opinions on the political and social issues of the day, or of modifying its corporate activities to foster social or political values. Now, the key phrase here is heavy presumption. There's a difference between a presumption, no matter how heavy, and an absolute prohibition. Presumptions can be overridden in extraordinary circumstances. They are rules, but they have exceptions. Absolute prohibitions do not have exceptions. They are never overridden, not even in extraordinary circumstances. One of the extraordinary circumstances or exceptions articulated by the Kalven report concerns the university's ownership of property and its receipt of funds. The report states that in exceptional circumstances, the university's ownership of property and its receipt of funds may need to be reassessed because they are incompatible with paramount social values. So here it's worth stressing, I think, the historical context. When the report was written in 1967, the Second World War was a recent memory, and many prominent refugees of European fascism were teaching on this campus. The Kalven report sensibly acknowledges that appalling things happen in this world, and they are sometimes so appalling that the university cannot involve itself with their perpetrators, financially or otherwise. These are rare cases, but they do exist. the last 20 years, the university's policy has repudiated this sensible policy. The first time was in 2007 when President Zimmer, backed by the Board of Trustees, rejected a petition to divest from the genocide in Darfur. Zimmer did not argue that it wasn't a genocide, nor did he argue that even if it's a genocide, that's not the sort of thing that's incompatible with paramount social values. He just said, we don't subject our investment decisions to that kind of concern, no matter what. But this was a new policy. Decades earlier, when Hannah Gray was president, there had been a movement to divest from South African apartheid. And at that point in its history, the university still acknowledged that, in exceptional cases, a concern for paramount social values places a constraint on what the university can legitimately do, including how it handles its financial investments. Under President Gray, the university distinguished itself from its peers, to its discredit, in my opinion, by not completely divesting from South African apartheid. But to its credit, it did commit to the Sullivan Principles, which restricted investment to companies that treated their employees a little less bad than other South African companies. These Sullivan Principles were designed expressly to apply economic pressure to the South African government in protest against apartheid. So this university submitted its investment activity to the Sullivan Principles, not because its own mission was at stake, but because indifference to South African apartheid was incompatible, in its judgment, with paramount social values. It is one of those exceptions to the rule. That was the judgment. So the policy that was adopted by Zimmer and that is now being carried on by Alevi Santos is new. According to this new position, there is nothing so appalling that we will not profit from it if we can. If apartheid is profitable, the university will profit from it. If ethnic cleansing, from ethnic cleansing. If genocide, from genocide. Nothing is ruled out by this policy. Now, the first objection to the principle is, of course, that it's repugnant to any humane impulse. No one can be proud to be associated with an institution that proclaims that as its principle. But in addition to being a moral embarrassment, it's profoundly anti-intellectual. Before there was an absolute prohibition, the university had to exercise judgment. When the question arose whether to divest from South African apartheid, the university had to consider how its activities here in the United States and Chicago related, financially and otherwise, to activities on the other side of the world. And that opened scope for conversation and debate on this campus about those activities. But once we have adopted a principle of absolute prohibition, all such substantive conversation is over. The absolute prohibition against divestment is, again, very different from a heavy presumption against it, because presumptions, as I mentioned, can always be overridden. Because they can always be overridden, each new case requires us to consider the possibility that this new case is exceptional. So with every investment decision, as with every institutional partnership that it forms, the university implicitly takes a position on the question whether a proposed course of action is normal business or exceptional. Is it fair play or out of bounds? That question is always open. Now, it doesn't become explicit except in exceptional circumstances, and that's a very rare occurrence. But I think this position, the actual position of the Kalven report, is a much more sensible one for the university to adopt, and it does, of course, raise an important question, which is who decides? Who decides whether consorting with genocide is fair play or out of bounds, for example? I'm not going to get into that. My time is up, but I hope it's a question we'll come back to.
So I want to make 3 points. One, I'm going to argue that divestment, nearly all examples or proposals for divestment violate Kalven and actually are at tension with other policies such as shills and civil rights law. Second is divestment would probably not be effective at harming the target of the divestment. And third, even if it were effective, would be a bad policy for the university. And before I begin, I want to be very clear. Genocide is bad. Racism is bad. And in your personal portfolio, you should take action on that on those moral claims. Nobody is arguing here that you shouldn't do so personally. The question is whether you should have power over the university to guide its investment according to your morals. Okay, so with that caveat, let me start with the Kalven report. The Kalven report bars collective political and social statements by the university. It says that faculty should make those statements or divest out of their personal portfolios, not the university. And part of the reason is comedy. We have different views, and nearly on all the important things. Where someone sees genocide, somebody else sees valid self-defense. Those are very hard to reconcile. We allow people to act on their individual basis, on their individual portfolios. We try not to do it as a group in order to minimize tension so we can continue on our mission, which is research and teaching. The exceptions in Kalven are actually quite narrow. You're right, there's a heavy presumption, but I want to be very clear. The rule is the exception applies for activities that threaten the, quote, very mission of the university. And I want to point out a conundrum right here. Nearly all proposals for divestment are ones that are not yet adopted, and yet the university thrives. It continues on its mission, which is per se evidence that it's not a threat to our very mission. This is an effort to impose morality, which is fine, but we should see it as that and not critical. In very rare cases, is it critical to the very mission of the university. There are notable examples, and one of the most important is divestment from Israel, which illustrates one of the issues. Problem with the divestment from Israel proposals is that they're not made against all countries that engage in genocide against Muslims or all countries that have religious majorities, such as Nepal and Hinduism for a while, or Pakistan and Islam. They're selected disproportionately against Israel, which raises the concern, without making the argument, raises the concern that they're not anti-Israeli, they're anti-Jewish. Now, why is that a problem? First, that's inconsistent with principles of Shills. Even if it's not what your intent is, it leads to that environment. Second, it creates a hostile work environment, which we know, if you've gone through the training as faculty, you know that you're not supposed to do that. And this would create that. Doesn't matter what your intent is, you have to think about what the impact is on the other members of our community. Second issue that I want to bring up is that divestment would not be effective at harming the target. Take Israel for an example. It doesn't really depend on investment from the University of Chicago. We're a tiny portion of the capital that flows there. Any capital we took away, and this is true for many targets, not just Israel, other capital markets would fill in. Also, we have a finance professor here who's certainly might tell you about Modigliani-Miller theorem, which says that when you change your portfolio as a company, your investors change their portfolio to offset it. So it doesn't really matter what your portfolio is. You can imagine the same thing is true of faculty. If you have some faculty that are invested in Israel, some faculty that are opposed to Israel, you shift your policy on Israel as the university, especially if it involves pensions, and the individual faculty members will shift their personal portfolios to offset that. No big effect. If anything, trying to divest will actually hurt the university. The goal of the university, at least in its endowment, should be to maximize returns so that it can engage in its missions, has financial resources to do so. And again, I mean risk-adjusted returns. But by putting constraints on it through divestment, you're limiting that. And that actually hurts the resources that are available to the university. Finally, it's incredibly hard to implement divestment. You have to identify the target and make sure you divest from that target. But it's very easy for the target to engage in financial maneuvering, very hard to overcome those financial maneuvering, to stop you from identifying the target. An Israeli company could then just place a vehicle in between the Israeli company and the university can invest in that vehicle, not knowing that it was investing in, say, Israel. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Third argument, divestment, even if effective, would be very bad for the university. The goal of the university is mainly to create human capital, our students. Yes, we also do research. We also run a very big hospital, but primarily we produce human capital. And we're very important for the country. It's a very strategic industry. Now, we would not advise, for example, a maker of airplanes or a maker of chips or a maker of a drug to say, hey, please get involved in politics or culture wars. We wouldn't tell them that because that would likely invite political backlash that would stop them from producing chips well, planes well, drugs well. It's the same thing for us in human capital. One thing that should be apparent after January 20th is our views may not be the views that are in Washington, D.C. As we impose them on ourselves, we will invite backlash, which can then harm the university generally, including in our funding. Finally, let me end with this. Please be wary of Mott and Bailey maneuvers. It's very easy to make a bold claim, then retreat to a very defensible act like genocide is bad, but then when you allow that, later on they come back with the Bailey. we should be careful. There are slippery slopes. We need to keep the door closed because we're worried about the slippery slopes. In some cases, they are a real threat.
So, when there are 3 faculties at the University of Chicago, there are 4 different opinions. And let me start from the Kalven report that I'm a little bit hesitant because Anup is a professor at the law school, so he's much better at reading text than I am, but I interpret it in a very different way than he does. So let me start by saying that I strongly support the view that the university should not engage in political statement in one way or another. So I think that the main reason is because it really jeopardizes the freedom of people inside the university to do whatever they want. If our president or if the university takes an official position that there are only 2 genders, and I study that the 3rd gender or the mixed gender, whatever, I don't feel free if the university take a position, and vice versa, of course. So I think that the university is right in not taking those positions unless they really threaten the functioning of the university. So if at some point there is a law that restricts freedom, I think the university, freedom of speech, for example, the university should take an active position. I come from Padua, and there is a very impassioned speech of the president of the Padua University just when the Nazis took over in 1943. He took a very strong position. Then he actually left because he was threatened by the Nazis. But I think it's very important to have the courage to take the position when they're so dramatic. However, I think that where Anup is misreading is that there are 2 exceptions. In the Kalven report, one say is in one situation when it threatened the goal of the university, even when it doesn't threaten the goal of the university, there is a moral case in which you can make an exception. And by the way, this was not shared by all the members of the committee because George Stigler actually made an exception, and he said that he agrees with all the Kalven report except that moral exception. And so besides sort of a functional interpretation of what is convenient for the university, there is an issue of a moral interpretation or legitimate interpretation. Should the university be concerned about something else than performing the mission, which is to share knowledge, create knowledge, disseminate knowledge in the most effective way? So let's take it out of the normal political sphere. Imagine that we massively invest in Korea in a factory that raise and slaughter dogs for food until it's currently still available. If you are really hungry for dogs, you have to go in Korea in the next 2 years, because after that it will be illegal to do it on a mass industrial production. You can still do it at home and kill your dog and eat it. It's not illegal. And by the way, it was not illegal in the United States until 2018. So it's not something that is violating any law. But I think that everybody would be pretty disgusted if we ever think about this idea. Now, we have a different opinion because you might be disgusted about slaughtering horses. I come from Italy, and horses is a typical food. And so, by the way, are rabbits and ducks and a lot of other things. Maybe that's the reason why Trump might want to kick me out of this country, because I eat pets. But anyway, the point is that morality is different, is not necessarily shared. And the challenge, and the Kalven report, I think, raises this, is that we don't have a governance system to resolve this moral conundrum. So when it comes to morality, I say, in the case of a company, for me, it's easy to tell, because I want the moral decision to be made by who pay the cost for that morality. And in the case of a company, by and large, are shareholders. So I actually do believe that the shareholders should have the right to vote and make decisions that are not maximizing shareholders' value. They should maximize their own utility, because after all, they are the shareholders. They own the damn thing. They can do whatever they want, including not maximizing shareholders' value, but pursuing something more decent, or give up some of the value because they consider indecent. For a university, it's a little bit more tricky because certainly I'm not the student. And this is, I thought it was funny when I say, I don't want my money to be invested in Israel. I said, no, this is not the right way to look at it. You should say, I want to pay a higher tuition in order not to be invested in Israel. Because we know that the money of the tuition is not invested in the endowment, it's the other way around. The endowment reduces the cost of the tuition. So it's not obvious that are the students. It's not obvious that are the faculty, because the faculty, they are shielded by tenure and against reduction in wages. If the faculty were to give up that right and they could have a decrease in wages, they should be the one voting for that decision. Maybe the alarm should make this decision, because at the end of the day, the people that suffer most from the cost of a reduction in the quality of a university are the alarm who are stuck with that degree. The students, after all, they just came, they should know what they're getting. And because I'm out of town, I will continue later, but I want to make a very important point that we should, however, be very transparent on our choices, because we do want students to make their choices as consumers, so that they can say, look, you came to this university, you know what you're invested, now you cannot complain. And so we should say to faculty, this fact that we cannot reveal how we invest, I think that's very disturbing, because it's really against actually informed consumer choices that are at the basis of a free society.
Prepared a couple of questions based on how this is going. I may get through two before opening it up for the audience, because I think your questions are probably more interesting than mine. But many of you referenced the Kalven exceptions paragraph, which I just want to read, which states, from time to time, instances will arise in which the society or segments of it threaten the very mission of the university and its values of free inquiry. In such a crisis, it becomes the obligation of the university as an institution to oppose such measures and actively defend its interests and values. There's another context in which questions as to the appropriate role of the university may possibly arise. Situations involving university ownership of property, its receipt of funds, its awarding of honors, its membership in other organizations. Here, of necessity, the university, however, it acts, must act as an institution in its corporate capacity. In the exceptional instance, these corporate activities of the university may appear so incompatible with paramount social values as to require careful assessment of the consequences. So my question is, since 2023, Israel has destroyed 80% of schools as well as every university in the Gaza Strip, something the United Nations experts have referred to as scholasticide. Is this compatible with, quote, paramount social values?
So I think I'm the dissenting voice here. So let's read that text for a second. If you're a textualist, you would look at that and you say, not only, sorry, if you're a textualist and you read that letter, that report, you would say not only it has to threaten our mission, and it has to be a paramount social concern. It doesn't say or, it doesn't say, oh, it's a genocide, we can still teach our students, but that's okay because it's or. It's to be both. Now,
No,
I'm not,
sorry,
hold on,
sorry.
I'm not arguing that you have to be
Sorry,
textualist about it.
Can we read the text?
Yes,
There is another context.
Another.
Another. When you say another, is another in English. I'm sorry. There is another
Another,
context
a different
in which
one,
this
a
question.
second one.
This is a separate
Yeah.
story.
No,
it's
I-
not the same. From time to time.
Yes. Oh, so let me, wait, no, you're not in the sentence I was referring to. That's the second point. Let me get to that in a second. So the first one is the main place where the exception is defined says you got to meet both these two conditions. Now, I'm not saying that you should have a textual interpretation. It's a report, not a legislation. So we can have a debate about what that scope is. However, even when you go and you look at our past behavior, we didn't divest in Darfur. We didn't divest in South Africa. Yes, we have the Sullivan principles, but that's like the one exception where we tried to do a half move, which you admitted was a half move. Now let's look to that second thing. Look at the category of activity that they're talking about. They're not talking about investment. They're talking about receipt of property or making awards and a few other examples like that, where you have to make an affirmative step that you can't avoid. And it's not clear that in that it's saying you should definitely take social stances. It says in that sometimes you have to take social stances that are unfavorable. So it's not obvious that that second thing is another exception that's independent of the first one. The first overrides the second. The second is an example of situations where it might be hard to comply. Now, we can debate that sort of thing, but there's also the general merits of the question that you raise. You have one opinion on what's happening in Israel. There are other opinions. I may agree with you on that opinion or I might disagree with you, but there certainly are people that disagree. One is the UN reliable? It's debatable. There's a discussion about that. But it's also the case there are many other examples of scholasticide going on. For example, Afghanistan. The current regime there does not allow women, in particular girls, to get education. Is that nearly as bad? Should we get involved in that? We can find countless examples of this around the world. The one thing I want to be careful about is that we often end up with Israel. And you may say there's a good reason, but it is certainly a reasonable interpretation that we do that because we don't particularly like a religious group. And when that occurs, we create a hostile environment, which is an independent concern, independent of even the Kalven report or whatever concerns we may have about the policy. That is to say, the policy of Israel.
I think that I would like to bring the discussion at a higher level. And it says we can disagree on Israel, but that's not the point. The point is, as part of the university, should we ever have a situation where we do something about investment, for example, or not? And if we decide that we should in some occasion, what are the steps to do it? Because I agree with you, it's incredibly complicated. And, we might come up with a decision, we should do it, but it's too complicated, and maybe we compromise on morality and we go. But you seem to even raise the issue that we should not ever have any moral consideration whatsoever in our decision. I am strongly against that. I think that as a university, when there are some important moral issue, we should, and there is a consensus, and this is where the Israeli point is important, is because here I don't see a consensus. But my favorite example is today, if we were to invest in a company in a country where there is slavery that owns slaves, we would be all against that. Okay? And I would challenge you to say that you would be against divesting from that company. So are you saying that you are against divesting from that company?
I'm going to begin with the very first thing I said. I strongly encourage you in your private portfolio to divest from entities that engage in immoral behavior according to your own personal morals. You have that right. In fact, in the law, especially when it comes to First Amendment law, we have principles that say when you pass a regulation that impacts speech, try to do so in the narrowest possible way. Make sure it's narrowly tailored. Here, there is a narrowly tailored alternative that addresses the issue of let's not invest in things that are immoral, and that is change your personal portfolio. We allow that in our community. What you're asking is, should we have the right to change the investment portfolio of the university? And because we don't face the consequences of that, the price that you'd have to pay for higher tuition, things like that, you're asking me, should I get to play with other people's money? And I think the problem with playing with other people's money, which you would tell me, I think, is I don't have an incentive to get it right. I don't have to feel strongly my morals before I start asserting those morals on other people. I don't even have to check to see if I'm correct. And part of what I think we're trying to avoid here is that sort of moral hazard. Now, I agree with you. My view on dogs changed once I got a dog, but I'm going to act on that in my personal capacity. I don't think I need to have the university act on my behalf. Now, you can also come up with extreme examples. Aren't we all opposed to slavery? Aren't we all opposed to genocide? But there are very few examples where there's universal things that were condemned.
That's the point.
No, but
I'm
sorry, you
point
did
of
not
it.
answer the question. So you're basically saying that if there was such a company that owns slaves, you will not want the university to divest. You would say people in their personal portfolio, they should do it, but the university should abstain and still invest in that company because it's part of the S&P index.
First of all, it's super easy to make these really abstract, easy, clear-cut, black and white examples from a bioethics class or undergraduate philosophy class. That is not the real world. There are lots of examples of bad behavior. There are a lot of different places. Picking out one particular one is not just challenging, but can also lead to inconsistency. And again, I encourage you to divest in your personal portfolio.
Okay, we need to move on. I'm going to let Anton speak.
Yeah, the question is framed as a rare exception. So The choice we're given is an absolute prohibition or a heavy presumption. So admittedly, it's going to be an extreme case. If you're going to argue that there should be no exceptions, you cannot argue by saying, well, the points you're bringing up are about exceptions.
No, this is the Mott and Bailey point. You'll say, let's just find the rare exception where 100% of the faculty agree or 100% of the students agree that there's clear genocide, killing of dogs, things like that. But then once we allow the exception, the key is to police that exception. And my worry is that we wouldn't police it and it would slowly go from stopping genocide to the unpopular political cause on campus.
All right, I'm going to move to my next question, which is somewhat related to this conversation. So whatever one's position on the Kalven may be, which clearly it's differing among this group, it primarily addresses the role of the university in political and social action. So why is it not an expression of values when the university makes investment or divestment decisions that it believes will be good financially? And secondly, how would you describe the role of fund managers who are hired to administer the university's endowment? How are they accountable to the university's board of trustees and the university's community members, faculty, staff, alumni, et cetera, more broadly?
I think it is an expression of the university's political values, whether or not it divests or invests in certain things. And I think it goes for both of those. I mean, I agree that there's a lot of bad stuff that happens in the world. In normal business, bad things happen, and this university's got to operate in that kind of context. What I don't agree with is that we therefore say anything, absolutely anything goes. And that's the difference between an absolute prohibition on divesting and a heavy presumption against it.
Okay, here's the thing. I think what we're trying to debate here today is whether or not politics has to invade all aspects of an institution's behavior. For example, should it matter that the janitorial service that we hire has an owner that is pro-life? No. We might hire them because they're a good janitorial service or they had the lowest prices. And we can try to go through each of the university's individual functions and then make it all political, or we could decide, no, there's some things that are political. Those are the statements being made by the university. But a lot of the standard rote stuff, like managing its endowment, running its facilities, deciding which patients to take care of at the hospital, those are things that we're not going to let politics get involved with. And we're not going to make moral judgments each step of the way, because that's going to invite fights, internal fights about what is right and wrong. And that's not particularly helpful for what we do on a day-to-day basis, which is produce human capital. We produce great graduates. So my goal here partly is to say, you can act on your morals with your own private money. When it comes to the institution, let's try to keep politics out of it so that we can focus on the thing that we're here for, which is training students. Maybe also doing research and taking care of patients, but training students.
First of all, the statement you can do with your own money is partially false, because our 401k is in Vanguard, and you cannot easily divest from single staff in your 401k. So at the very minimum, the university should force Vanguard to give us that choice. And so, given you're so passionate about this, I propose that we do a petition, and you are the first signatories, to the president of the university, asking that Vanguard will give us that choice, because you're so passionate about the choice that you're going to fight with us to get the choice from the president. Now, given that, I think that we should be careful about your statement. I forgot okay, I passed that's enough.
All right, I'm going to ask one last question before opening up to the audience. Does it violate institutional neutrality when the university invests in study abroad programs or relationships with authoritarian governments who restrict free speech?
So it's not only that we invest, we send our faculty to places where they cannot speak. Not only they cannot speak in the place, but they cannot speak here because they can be arrested when they go there and teach. For those of you who are not at the business school, you might know that the business school has a campus in Hong Kong where there is the national security law that allows people to be arrested in Hong Kong if they say something that violates the national security law in Hong Kong or anywhere in the world. So you have to watch your Twitter account, you have to watch the paper you write, you have to watch the classes you teach, because last time, you know, there is a Chinese in your class who reports you to the Hong Kong authority, you arrive in Hong Kong, and you are arrested. And the university has refused to at least draw a line in the sand. They don't want to divest right away. I ask explicitly to say the university should go and publicly say, the first time you do anything to our faculty, even a minimum thing, we are going to withdraw everything with big fanfare, big statement. The university is not even willing to do that. I think that, to me, that's shameful.
There's a different situation with Israel. We have a study abroad program with Israel. It doesn't raise quite the same questions, admittedly, but we do have a program there that only some of our students are sure to be able to go to. I mean, not all of our students are going to be able to get entry to Israel for all sorts of reasons. And once they go, it's not such a great, it's not an unproblematic relationship to have for those reasons alone. I mean, I think there are lots of times when these questions are important. And moreover, I'd say, in thinking about whether it's a neutral position to have this kind of relationship, the study abroad program, other institutional relationships with that country, we should consider the fact that it's obviously very important politically to Israel that it have these relationships with this university. So last year, as many of you, I hope, know, the president of our university met with the Midwest Consul General of somebody from the Consulate of Israel. That person came to the university to build up these relationships with the university. This was days before the International Court of Justice ruled that there was a probable genocide going on. This was a diplomatic mission initiated by Israel to strengthen precisely those kinds of relationships with the university. Is that a violation of neutrality? Well, I mean, there's, as far as I know, there's never been a Palestinian delegation that's met with the president. We have no study abroad programs in Gaza.
So I actually think that this is a much more complicated issue than whether or not the university, in its investment portfolio of its endowment or pension, should divest. I do agree on the Vanguard point. We're in TIA, it doesn't allow you to do it. We should switch to Vanguard, which allow you to do it. I'm in favor. That's not the same thing as saying institutional position. It's a thing that says faculty, choose. I think that's great. But on this issue of authoritarianism, here's the trade-off. And I got to tell you, I got no answers to this. There are lots of countries that have policies that we don't like, that we might even consider huge, authoritarian, disrespect for women, disrespect for animals. The question is, should we disengage? So suppose you want to study in India and you're worried that the Modi regime is hostile to Muslims, or you want to go to study, like what the political situation in Afghanistan, and they're doing bad things with respect to education and particularly education of females and women's rights, or you want to go to Saudi Arabia and same sort of thing. Yes, I can see the moral argument, but there's also the other side of this, which is how are we going to learn about these places? The world isn't the United States, very clearly. Are we just not going to go there? Are we not going to fund that? Are we not going to attempt to engage in the debate so maybe we can change those societies? So it seems like there's going to be a cost to taking these absolute positions, and those are positions that are very temporally restricted. Today, Saudi Arabia is meaningfully different than it was 5 years ago. Maybe not the same thing as the United States, but different. And I don't know the extent to which our engagement, or people like us engaging, are part of that change. I'm a little bit more open-minded about these things. And again, I would let the faculty decide, do they want to take the risk of going to these countries where there's risk of arrest? I would like to see the university stand up for us a little bit more, but a prohibition on that seems tough. And I also want to remind you that, look, it's really, really easy to find common enemies. In 2011, everybody wanted to take a strong stand against a certain set of countries, and what we had to worry about is Islamophobia. Today, we're doing a different thing, except it's with Israel. Temporary emotions can really get the better of us, and sometimes we need these principles, Kalven, to get us to stop ourselves from acting when we're in a really emotional or excited state, so that we can think about it, and also letting individuals act so that people can express their disagreement and not be forced to go along with what somebody else's morality.
All right, let's open it to questions from the audience. I see a hand back there. Can you please wait for the mic? Because if you're not on the mic, it doesn't get recorded in the video.
Sure. Thank you so much. This was really an engaging and truly remarkable discussion. I first want to offer a point of clarification that many of our peer institutions, and depending on your opinion of the old University of Chicago and its relationship to the current University of Chicago, did benefit from investments in slavery. And so the decision to dismiss the slavery example out of hand as somehow a rare and impossible example is simply not grounded in historical fact. At the time of its founding, Dartmouth had more enslaved people on campus than faculty or students. Princeton, UVA, Washington, and Lee can go on. So to set that aside, I'm really fascinated by the contention that the issue is partially that we're unable to reach a consensus. And a hypothetical question is, let's say that we were able to reach a consensus. The standard therein should be consensus among whom, and what is the justifiable argument for the status quo, where is that the only bar for that consensus is that it exists among financial managers or trustees? Thank you.
Well, I mean, one thing to notice is that in the case of Darfur, there was consensus. No one doubted that it was a genocide. The U.S. government called it a genocide and helped people divest from it. It was not at all like this current question about Israel. So, or again, take climate change. This is not a divisive issue on our campus, and moreover, it's not an issue that the university is neutral on. Still, we can't divest. Why? Everybody agrees. The university, in the voice of the president, says this is an important problem for humanity that the university as an institution must take steps on. And we still aren't allowed to divest. You can't claim that political neutrality is the issue here.
So I don't interpret the difficulty of neutrality as leading to the same conclusions as you do, I think. Yes, it's true. It's very hard to figure out what neutrality is. I think we can agree that if we hired an investment manager that says, I want to invest in South Africa back in the day, or I wanted to invest in Russia today, we might say, well, that's not the goal. The goal is just maximize returns, risk-adjusted returns. And I'm okay with that. Try to get them not to take on their own particular preferences. Might be difficult to enforce, but that's what I would do. But the fact that beyond that, it's very hard to define what exactly neutrality is doesn't mean that we open the floodgates and then do everything else. Again, Mott Bailey, okay? Yes, neutrality is hard. Does that mean you should have no effort to try to get to neutrality and let people to decide on their own? No, it just means we understand that's a hard policy, but as a general principle, we don't trust ourselves coming up with a universal rule, okay? And one of the difficulties, it's very hard to come up with a universal rule. The reason you think that there's universality is because the people that want to express themselves spoke up. And the rest of us who are afraid to express ourselves because we thought we'd get socially sanctioned, don't keep ourselves, are quiet. We're the silent plurality or large minority. It doesn't have to be majority. And until we have a way to resolve that, what we think is universal consensus is probably not a universal consensus. And one really good way to get universal consensus is let people act on their own account.
I think that in the Kalven report, one of the reasons precisely why they say we shouldn't or we should try to do a limit to exceptional cases is because we don't have a governance system to resolve the problem who does it. So if I'm not claiming I have the perfect solution, but if I were forced to tell who should decide, my inclination would be to actually randomly select a group of alumni, because the real residual claimant are the alumni. They are stuck with our degree. If our degree goes to hell, they lose value. They are the one that actually, and they cannot move. When it says the faculty can move, the students can move, the alumni cannot move. And they're the one that donate a lot of money collectively. And so I think that they should be the one decided in these extreme cases. And I do believe in democracy. And I think that the best way to do it, in my view, would be to randomly select a group of alumni, put them in a room, and decide to the policy on these various issues. That will not be so controversial. That will not be done in the heat of the moment. Would be used deliberation. Is in the spirit of the jury system that works fairly well in the United States. And so I think that to me would be the natural way to resolve it. Now, it occurred to me what I wanted to say earlier, which is we have to be careful with this thing. We let managers to maximize value, and that's the neutral position. Because in reality, they don't. They interpret what they want in their own goal. There was a phenomenal case in the late 60s, early 70s of Dow Chemical. As you remember, Dow Chemical was producing the napalm that was used in Vietnam. And an investor actually brought a case to ask to stop producing, not stop producing napalm, to stop selling napalm to people who might use against human beings, i.e. the US government. And the management said, but you know, we don't produce napalm to make money. We produce napalm because we are patriotic, and this is our duty as a US citizen to produce something that is good for our army. So this is a company that say, we're not maximizing shareholder value. We have values simply different from the one of the students who wanted to stop them. So I think that the fig leaf that, oh, let them maximize value is basically say, let managers decide for us, and we don't take any responsibility. And sometimes it's convenient not to take responsibility, but I think that as citizens and as faculty, we need to take our responsibility. Go ahead.
Can you also please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Cliff Endo. I'm in classics. And first, I'd like to thank the forum for hosting this. I was actually in the committee of the council at the 50th anniversary of Kalven and tried to get the then provost and president to host a session in which we discussed Kalven. And they said, oh, a celebration of Kalven, that's a great idea. And I said, no, I didn't say celebration. Maybe we could, we're a university, maybe we could talk about Kalven. And need to say, it never happened then. So I want to, actually, mostly what I want to do is ask the panelists to return to what I took to be Kimberly's question, which people seem to have set aside, because everyone seems to take divestment as a form of speech. That is, changing your investment is a form of speech. It's a political expression. But whatever we're otherwise doing that is not divesting is not a form of speech, which I find insane. I mean, it simply cannot be that our current investment strategy is not an expression of values, and that changing investment is not an expression of values. And the climate change would be a perfect case in point. I mean, today we saw in the stock market a response to the recent election, a huge one-day rise in the value of mining companies that produce coal. And I take it that, you know, an intelligent thing to do immediately after the election would have been, in fact, to invest in coal. It was perfectly obvious that our president would do what he has now done and said he would like to produce more energy from coal. But investing in coal would have been not simply a financial act. It would have been an expression of politics. I don't see how, following up on what Anton said, I don't see how an investment strategy around energy is not a political act at this point.
It's a political act if you want to make it one, but it doesn't have to be. I invest in the S&P 500. The S&P 500 went up after Trump got elected. That doesn't mean I support Trump. I have an investment advisor that makes some investments, and they decide to invest in something, maybe a defense company. That doesn't mean I support the activities of the defense company. Sometimes I do things where the results are affected by political change, but that's not what I intended. And so one can imagine a situation where we say we're going to hand some money over to investment managers. Our goal and our dictate to the, or advice, our instruction to the investment managers, please maximize our risk-adjusted returns so that we have the capacity to pursue our mission. Does that mean that we're 100% going to stop them from doing anything that is not 100%, isn't perfectly return maximizing? Can we 100% stop them from making any political decisions? No. But we don't intend them to make political decisions. And that's true even if there's not a clear neutrality. For example, if the person says, actually, I think Trump is going to be great for the stock market, I'm going to invest in broad-based index before he gets elected, and then it goes up. If the goal for us was to get maximal return, and the fact is that they got it off of a political return, our return was maximized because we wanted that, not because we specifically said we wanted Trump to win or we wanted to make a statement about Trump. And I think the problem is that we are so inclined to convert everything, simple things in our lives, into political things when we can't agree on the politics. So yes, there's no such thing as neutrality, but that doesn't mean that every act we take has to be political. Let's try to do less of that and just teach students.
No, but you are dodging the question. I think that the investment decision is I would call it a moral decision. I don't know why it's necessarily political, but a moral decision. And maximizing shareholder value is basically saying, I put zero consideration on morality. I only care about money, which is fine. But as an individual, you can do whatever you want. As an institution, I think you should live with this consequence. Is it really what the goal of this university, that the only dimension is return? And we don't care about how this return is done, is obtained? I don't think that does not represent my value. I would like to know what fraction of the faculty stands by, or the alum, or whatever group stands by the fact that we only care about money with no string attached, no morality attached. Clearly, this is not a Kalven report, because there are exceptions for the Kalven report. So you're free to think it this way, but at some point, there should be a decision by consensus. And I want to know how many people are on your side.
We have another question right here.
Thank you so much for this. I wanted to come back to something that Luigi already started to address, but sort of how could this decision be made? So maybe this, I think, Anton, you also sort of cut off at the question, who decides? And I would also be interested to hear, I mean, Luigi, you talked about, and I'm Julie Orlemansky in the English department. You mentioned a randomly selected group of alums, but you also talked about a sense of responsibility for students and for faculty. And Anton, I was very struck by your point about the kind of actual act of judgment and the kind of, the intellectual role of that. So I would be curious to hear, Anton and Luigi, what you thought about that. It doesn't sound like enough you see a possibility for something beyond beyond just a sort of I who gets to decide. But I'd love to hear a kind of vision for university responsibility and governance.
Yeah, I mean, the controlling idea of the Kalven report is a community of scholars. So I think the place to begin thinking about who should make the decision about what this institution is with the community of people who are involved in carrying out its core mission, the people who teach and who study and who research and who provide support for those activities. Now, should we include other people? Probably. Some alumni, for sure. There's a case to be made for alumni. What about the president and provost? Sure, they can have a vote. What about, certain donors? Aren't they part of our community? Yes. The person who gave an anonymous donation of $100 million, that person should get an anonymous vote. We can broaden it if we need to, but I think that's the place to start and the way to broaden it.
So I think that there is the problem that Anup was saying earlier of being very generous with other people's money. So I think that I would like, in my view, to connect this decision as close as possible to who bears the consequences of this decision. That's the reason why I was emphasizing the alum, because the alum do pay the cost, both in terms of reputation, and in
We have reputations.
no,
I mean, you have a reputation. You're associated with this
I
institution.
can go to another university if I want to. The alarm is stuck with that, and I
Can't wash it off, though.
No, that's true. But I think that actually the first step would be transparency, because as we know, a lot of companies now are forced to go in one direction or another because the workforce does not want to join under certain conditions. And so I think that if we have transparency, there will be faculty that say, I don't want to join the University of Chicago because the University of Chicago has a policy vis-a-vis investment, blah, 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 that is not what I share in terms of morality, and I don't want a part of that community. I think that, and the students might make the same decision. So I think that, to me, the first step is transparency, and then after that, we should have some mechanism to elicit a broader vote.
I wanted to make one other just point about I started by saying, it's not a holy text and we have to think about whether it's true. And there's one, and for the most part, I was defending as sensible its position, its central position. But there's one point in this area that I disagree with, and I think needs an argument that's not there. And that's the claim that a community of scholars cannot resort to majority vote to reach positions on public issues, even in these exceptional cases. Now, it gives a reason. The reason, it says, is that if it takes collective action, it does so at the price of censuring any minority who does not agree with the view adopted. This is the silent minority problem. Now, why? I mean, is the idea that in general, democratic decision-making is censuring a minority? Like, is democracy like hostile to free speech? Is that the position? Like in countries where people vote for their leaders, is there a tendency to find that people are inhibited or silenced or forced to be quiet for fear of social sanctioning? Is that true when we vote for appointments to our faculty or the minority? There's always a minority. Like, are they silenced? I don't, unless you think that democracy is hostile to freedom of speech, this seems to me implausible, very illiberal, and anti-democratic. I just don't see what the argument is.
I think I'm going to try.
We have two more questions.
Actually, I disagree on that. I think that the way I interpret the Kalven report is to say, when it comes to political position, you don't want to have an official sanctioned position, even with a majority. So if the faculty votes, there are only two genders, and I want to do research on middle sex, I feel intimidated because the official position of the university is there are only two genders. And so that is jeopardizing my freedom of speech. So I don't see a reason why we should take those positions. And I think they are scary to the dissenter. We should be free to have this dissension because if the official position come most of the time with a sanction.
Okay.
Sorry, can I just?
We have to take more questions from the audience. The mic is back there.
Okay, hi, I'm Genevieve Lake here. I teach the law school. So I have a genuine question here that is troubling me because I am very sympathetic to the idea that the university can never be neutral and that there can be no distinction between investment and disinvestment, and that in these exceptional circumstances, we are clearly an institution organized around certain core values not only of free expression and free inquiry, but I think a certain kind of egalitarianism, secularism, and inclusiveness. I think these are all sort of central, fundamental, and very significant values that allow us to do the things we do every day. It's not just teaching. In order to teach, we have to be committed to these values. But these also feel to me like values that are deeply imperiled in the outside political world. And so I want to take seriously this question about backlash or context, because it does seem to me that the push for divestment is not because the primary view is that it's going to economically harm the companies or the institutions from whom the university divests, but that's going to communicate a political message or a moral message, a message about stigma, that there is something terribly wrong that allows us, that requires us, this otherwise reputable institution, to break our ties with this set of actors because what is happening is so beyond the pale. And that's why, in fact, that helps explain why perhaps this message is only effective if it is exceptional, and we shouldn't expect so much a slippery slope, because the slippery slope actually devalues the power of the message, which is not primarily economic, it's political. But at the same time, we're operating in a very complicated political environment, and I just feel today and yesterday how vulnerable these institutions, this institution, although maybe this institution less than others, but many of these institutions of higher education are to, I guess, Anoop described it as backlash or political response that in fact ultimately does not lead to the ends that the push for divestment or other political statements may make. And so I'm wrestling with this. So I'm curious, when we're thinking about the policies that the university adopts, how much do we take account of the complex political dynamics, the field in which we're operating as an institution? Or should these decisions be made purely on a moral basis, that we are committed to certain values when there are inconsistencies with those values that are sufficiently egregious, we're just going to take action. We don't need to think about whether this is going to lead to threats, retribution. How do we think about this today?
So I want to chime in here. I think that's a very thoughtful comment, but I want to stress two things. First is I want to stress that we have some modesty. There are plenty of universities around the world that operate in dramatically different political contexts that generate remarkable students and scholars. China does great AI research. China does great STEM research across the board, chemistry, biology, et cetera, and operates in a far different environment. So in order to make the argument, and I'm not saying that you're making this argument, but some people do, that like, oh, we need to take moral statements, otherwise it interferes with their day-to-day lives. No, it doesn't. There are dramatically different societies with dramatically different moral positions that are producing perfectly good students. And in fact, we're happy to admit them, and we wouldn't have unless they were very good students. So I think I want to be a little bit modest and say there's a lot we can do to teach people without taking moral stances and political stances on everything. And that's not saying don't do it. Do it in your personal life. Just we don't need to do it at work. It's empirically not true. The second one is I also want to encourage modesty about the future and past. The world changes. If we had this conversation in 1955, I know that was before Kalven and Shills, we might vote in a way that's not very friendly to our African-American colleagues. And then we'd enshrine that. That seems like a bad idea. Now you might say, no, we're at the pinnacle of human moral development in 2025. And I think that might not be true. They probably thought that in 1955. I want to allow for the possibility that morality changes, that we should be a little bit modest about what morality is going to be. I don't know what my 60-year-old self is going to think of my 50-year-old self even. So let's just step back and say maybe we can just do our job without the politics. And that means taking divestment off the table to the extent possible.
There's a question right here.
Thank you. I'm Callum Ross from Organismal Biology and Anatomy, and I want to speak to the question of how we might actually go about divesting. I asked my financial advisor about whether divestment actually works, and he assured me that it doesn't, for the reason that one of the panel members said, someone else will just buy the shares. So it becomes contentless virtue signaling, and I don't think that that's what this university should be about. But let's just assume we wanted to get into that. Who's going to decide the suggestions being put forward that we should vote on it? Well, I don't think we should be voting on these kinds of issues. This is not a democracy, it's a corporation. And if we start voting, then we will start considering how people are going to vote when we hire them. We will be asking people, are you pro-Israel? Are you pro-Iran? Because this is really a war between Iran and the rest and the West, and Israel and Gaza are fighting it for us. I mean, we all know that, right? But so are we going to say, oh, this person, we want to hire them into our department, but they might actually vote pro-Iran. We shouldn't hire this person in our department because they're Jewish. Or maybe we should divest from companies because they're owned by Jews. This is not going anywhere good. There is no way to make these decisions in a way that is not arbitrary. And talk about a slippery slope. This is a dangerous place to go. I like being in an institution where Paul doesn't speak for me, where my dean doesn't speak for me, my chair doesn't speak for me, that Anton can write articles about democracy at the University of Chicago and how it's not a democracy, and we disagree about that. I like being in a place where Ali Reza can have a course where he talks about violent resistance. I like being at a university where Luis can invite Steve Bannon to speak here. I disagree with the invitation, but I like being in this place. And I don't want people voting on what I teach in my class. What's next? Maybe, Cliff, we should have a vote on what you teach in your class. I teach anatomy. I teach embryology. I teach the timing of human development. I do not talk about abortion. That's not my job. And it's not our job to be taking stances on political issues like this. There's practically no way of doing it that looks good to me. Thank you.
First, to the question of how it works and whether it has any effect. Somebody else will buy it if you don't buy it. I mean, what seems clear, this seems like a kind of distraction in the circumstances, this kind of, the technical details here, because what seems clear is that AIPAC cares a lot about whether major universities divest from Israel. And AIPAC wouldn't think it matters if Israel didn't think it mattered. It's not just Israel that thinks it matters. Palestinian civil society thinks it matters. That's why they called on anybody who sympathized with them to do this. So the parties to the political contest think it matters what we do in this situation. And that suggests to me that the effect that it has, the mechanism by which it matters one way or another, is not something that your financial manager is expert in. It's not a purely economic issue, it's a political issue. It matters for the same sort of reason it would matter if Israel was not allowed to participate in the Olympics or in FIFA. It's that kind of mattering. So I don't think it's empty virtue signaling, and I think you can tell it's not empty because of how much it matters to the people who are involved in it. Now, nobody was suggesting that we vote on what people teach in their classes also. The only suggestion was that if a decision needs to be made in the rare circumstance where it's being considered whether some action of the university crosses the line, it's got to be made by somebody. I don't think it should be made by a financial advisor. They don't have any special expertise in what is compatible and what's not compatible with paramount social values. Neither does the president, neither do the board of trustees. None of us does. In that sort of situation, I think it's a very sensible way to go. It's rare, but in that situation, I think it's a very sensible way to go that we decide, this community of scholars decides together. We have a period of public deliberation. It would be very educational. It would be very, and at the end of it, we would decide something. We're not deciding the question, how many genders are there? We're deciding what to do when some decision needs to be taken by someone.
There's a question back there.
Thank you. I'm Scott Kalbach in the Political Science Department in the Harris School. So I guess precisely on Anton's comment, but I think this is also a question for Luigi. So whoever makes the decision, if a decision is to be made that this is an exceptional circumstance, I guess I'm hung up on the details of exactly how that decision is made. So there are all sorts of voting rules that are consistent with democratic behavior. We make jury decisions by unanimous rule because depriving a person of their liberty is an extraordinary circumstance. And so setting aside the questions about potential retaliation against faculty or looking down the game tree when we're deciding who we hire and how we think they're going to vote and so forth, what sort of vote should be necessary by the faculty, by the alumni, by whatever body of individuals is making this decision to change the investment policy of the university? I guess I understand that an exceptional circumstance implies some sort of supermajority. You can disagree with that premise, but I'm curious how you envision the actual decision being made.
So first of all, the most difficult thing is what we're going to discuss for a candidate for divestment, because I'm sympathetic to the Anoop's view that there's a slippery slope. Today is Israel, tomorrow is another country, and by the end of the year, you have 250 things you want to divest from. So I think that you should have an exceptional thing, and I've not given a lot of thoughts about this, but the little I thought about is you want to treat it like as a referendum. So you need to have a quorum of alum or faculty. If you have the signature of 20% of the alum or 30 or 40% of the faculty, they want to discuss this topic, then this topic should be discussed, otherwise not. Okay, so pretty high threshold of people involvement to bring it to the table. And then, as I said, my favorite solution is a random selection of alum. You put them in a room for a long weekend, they make a decision, then the decision is implemented by the investment committee. After all, the investment committee follows rules. So at the moment, we only tell them maximize adjusted return, risk-adjusted return, and we can say maximize risk-adjusted return with this particular caveat. They might not like it because they might get less in commissions, but they follow rules.
We need a mic. We can't hear on the videos. Sorry, can
I
you
think
repeat
that
the
you need
question
to
on the
have
mic?
some form of
Is the
majority.
decision made by consensus or by majority rule of the people in the room, or how is it made?
I think that having total consensus among Chicago faculty alum is impossible. So you need to have a majority rule, whether you want a super majority rule. I think is also very much a function of how costly this strategy is. Because to be honest, it's true, Anoop is right, that from an economic point of view, then there is a political point of view. From an economic point of view, Israel is not that damaged if we stop investing. It's also true that from a Chicago endowment point of view, Israel is a very small country. And the impact on our risk-adjusted return, if we divest from Israel, is basically zero. Okay? Now, it's not a reason to do it, but I'm saying if you want to divest from China, or if you want to divest from Europe, that's a big chunk of the foreign portfolio, etc. But Israel is not. So there are cost issues. Hopefully, in a deliberative assembly in which you have different experts talking, the cost issue will be brought into place and will be factored in this decision. But yeah, it would not be an unanimous decision. I've not figured out whether you want a majority, a supermajority, or something like that. Probably a supermajority, but you don't want to be prohibitively large, probably 2/3 or something like this.
I just want to chime in here. We have something really valuable at the University of Chicago, which is we live in a live and let live equilibrium, where we go around, do our work, kind of the comment that was made earlier. When we go and start including a lot of things like divestment in our political decisions, whatever the process, majority rule, consensus, whatever, we're going to jeopardize that equilibrium. And that's going to make it very hard for us to function. When lots of our activities are going to be about politics, whether I vote for your tenure is going to be a function about whether or not you voted for or against Israel. That's terrible. Let's keep our community. It's very hard to preserve our culture, which is a highly productive culture. We are great teachers. I think we produce great scholarship. We're risking that so that we can make some political statements that might not have a big effect and that in the long run might not be good for us. Even if we did a majority vote, and let's suppose we had somebody put a proposal, we should not support Republicans. We're 90% Democrat. Of course that's going to pass. And then what happens when a Republican comes into office? We're going to find consequences that flow from that. The best way is to tie our hands and say we're not going to get involved in politics unless it's absolutely essential, and that's a very, very high standard. And I think that we should try to hew to that as much as possible so that we can do what we do best. Teach our students, produce scholarship, and take care of patients at the hospital.
I mean, it's strange to hear an argument from faculty that we should tie our hands. I mean, who's going to, so we should leave the decisions in the hands of unappointed members of the Board of Trustees who appoint one another? I mean, that's the prefer. I mean, the point is somebody's making a decision. Maybe they vote, maybe it's a majority, maybe it's a supermajority. I don't know. They figure it out. Somebody is making decisions. It's a strange distrust of one another. It's like, as soon as we make this possible, as soon as we make it possible for us to collectively make a decision, that idiot's going to be asking for one thing, that idiot's going to be asking for another thing. We're never going to be done dealing with these idiots. That's the implicit view. It's come out here a couple of times, but I really think that's that illiberal kind of anti-democratic suspicion of joint public deliberation is a pervasive feature of the personality of this institution, and it comes out sometimes, and you hear it sometimes, but it's always surprising when you hear people say, "I would rather the boss make the decision."
There's a question back there.
Hi, my name is Ariel Scotis. I'm a librarian at the D'Angelo Law Library, and this has been a really fascinating discussion, and thank you so much. I guess I still have a couple of questions, and I want to put this in bigger context. I'm not just, an other academic appointee, which means I don't have tenure. Surprise. So that puts me inherently in a more vulnerable position, even speaking now, right? Theoretically. It means the power dynamic is quite different. But I also am a third generation graduate of the college. So this place is very special and very important for a lot of reasons. And I guess I have a couple of questions. One is that I don't think we really addressed the backlash concerns that Genevieve brought up and Anoop did as well. I don't think it's so much a question of, oh, we can't trust these idiots. I think it's a question of power dynamics, which frankly is missing from this discussion, right? And not just power dynamics within the university, but also power dynamics outside of the university. Even just reading about the executive orders that are being out right now is kind of eye-opening. So I guess that's sort of my big question is about context and thinking both about power dynamics and also just within the university and without the and outside of the university, and also thinking about then triggers, right? What triggers this high level? Like what triggers this conversation? And I will say too, I'm very conflicted. I don't know how to feel, frankly, because I definitely have very strong points of view individually, but that bright line of where that trigger happens and how it happens is another part of how we would do this that I wonder about. I'm sorry, I hope that made sense. It's after 5.
I don't have a response. I do believe that power dynamics matter. It doesn't mean that we can just ignore them. So I think that's what you're saying is we have to think about them. The reality is, we like to think that our view is the only view as a consensus, and it's not. I don't think that the election that happened is what the vast majority of the faculty want. Without even revealing my view, I think it'd be really hard to make that argument. And as a result of that, that certainly tells me that we need to be, again, a little bit more modest about what the consequences of our behavior are. Let's look at the EOs that came out. I think one of the difficulties is there's actually two sides to, say, the executive order on anti-discrimination. On the one hand, I see the argument for DEI, but on the other hand, I see the argument for race neutrality. And, we try to teach our law students to see both sides of that. They can decide for themselves what the right side is. I try not to tell them what the right side is, but they should know the arguments on both sides, and we should have to appreciate that sort of thing. That doesn't mean we have to act on it. And all I'm saying is, you personally can act on it. I personally can act on it in my portfolio. I don't think we need to make the university act on our behalf for all the reasons that we've laid out before. And again, it's not an illiberal position. I'm telling you, you can act. You can act on your own behalf. That's very liberal. And if your view is that, oh, we're all enlightened, that's not really the way that our Constitution is structured. We have a Bill of Rights that specifically sets out counter-majoritarian restrictions because we're afraid that the majorities do some bad things when they get to always decide. Humans are not perfect. Let's understand our own foibles. Let's try to keep equilibria that work going and not jeopardize them.
All right, we have one last question before we should end today.
Before I comment, is there anyone who didn't? Okay. I just as a point of observation, I find it, I won't masquerade that this is a question. It's just a comment. As an alum of the college and a faculty member here, I find it, which I'm sorry, my name is Eve Ewing. I didn't introduce myself the first time. I find it really bizarre to have the presupposition that somehow debate and disagreement and lack of consensus is somehow antithetical to either the primary mission or the values of the university. And I just want to name that because multiple times it's been suggested, oh, if we do this, we're going to all disagree so much and it'll distract us from our primary work, which is teaching students. And I find that exceedingly bizarre, especially at the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression. And every time that point was implied, we all have to look at you all with these banners behind you. We're sitting here having a debate, right? So I find that really strange. And it makes me feel like perhaps we don't have consensus on even the most basic premises and values. As a descendant of enslaved people, I'm walking out of this room with this slavery question again put forth as like so crazy that it couldn't even be addressed. I mean, I now will go the rest of my week knowing that one of my colleagues could not say that we should not divest from a company that enslaves people in a hypothetical situation. So, but luckily for me, I have the freedom to express that concern and opinion. So thank you again for making that possible.
All right, and we will end on that. Tom?
Before I thank the panel, I want to make one brief announcement, which is we're going to have a event next week on Friday at the Rubenstein Forum, which is the 10th anniversary of the Chicago Principles. And we hope it will proceed in a similar spirit of open and intense inquiry, which is the University of Chicago way. But without further ado, please join me in thanking this remarkable panel for the discussion. Thank you.